The doctor's face was etched with concern, his voice a low murmur as he spoke. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, "your condition is unusual to say the least." John Blackwood, a man of routine and reason, sat rigidly on the sterile examination table. "Unusual," he echoed, the word catching in his throat. "Prosopometamorphopsia," the doctor continued, the medical term sounding heavy in the sterile room. "It's a rare neurological condition that affects facial perception." "What does that mean, doctor? What's happening to me?" John's voice was barely a whisper, tinged with a fear he couldn't quite place. "Essentially, Mr. Blackwood, your brain is misinterpreting faces. You may see them as distorted, grotesque, even demonic." The walk home was a blur of faces. Each stranger that passed seemed to morph and contort, their features twisting into nightmarish visages. John found himself averting his gaze, a cold sweat prickling at his skin. He reached his apartment, a place that had always been his sanctuary, and fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The familiar scent of old books and pipe tobacco did little to soothe his growing unease. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper now, the silence punctuated by whispers he couldn't quite decipher. He'd been having dinner with his neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, a kindly old woman who always brought him cookies. As she spoke, her features seemed to melt and reform, her eyes glowing with an infernal light. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee usually calmed John's nerves, but today the bustling cafe felt like a scene from a nightmare. The barista's cheerful smile twisted into a grotesque sneer, his teeth seeming to lengthen into jagged fangs. John looked away, his pulse quickening. He tried to focus on his newspaper, but the words swam before his eyes, morphing into arcane symbols. His hands trembled as he lifted his coffee mug to his lips, the familiar warmth doing little to quell the growing terror within him. He was surrounded by demons, their true faces hidden beneath a thin veil of normalcy. As he glanced at them, their faces contorted, their eyes burning with an eerie yellow light. John recoiled, his chair scraping against the floor, drawing startled glances from the other patrons. Back in his apartment, John retreated to the solace of his bathroom, the cool tile a stark contrast to the inferno raging within him. He splashed cold water onto his face, desperately trying to wash away the fear, the doubt, the chilling certainty that his mind was unraveling. He stared into the mirror, his reflection a stranger, his eyes wide with fear, his skin clammy and pale. He barely recognized himself, the face staring back at him, a hollow shell of the man he once was. As he watched, his reflection began to change. The familiar lines of his face twisted and contorted, his eyes taking on a sinister reddish glow. John stumbled back, his hand instinctively reaching for the light switch. The once familiar streets of John's city had transformed into a macabre carnival. Every face he encountered, from the weary bus driver to the giggling child in a stroller, contorted into a ghastly visage. Their expressions, once mundane and easily interpreted, now writhed with silent torment. Their features stretched and reshaped into monstrous caricatures. He crossed the street to avoid a group of teenagers, their laughter echoing in his ears like the screeching of harpies. Each one, he could see, bore the mark of the demonic. Horns protruding from beneath their hats, eyes burning with unnatural fire. Even the stoic faces carved into the granite of buildings seemed to mock him, their expressions twisting into leering grins. The city, once a source of comfort and anonymity, had become a hunting ground, its inhabitants replaced by an army of grotesque parodies. John retreated further into the confines of his apartment, his sanctuary now a prison of his own making. The outside world, with its unending parade of demonic faces, had become unbearable. He drew the curtains tight, shrouding his home in a perpetual twilight, a futile attempt to shut out the horrors that plagued his waking hours. Sleep offered little respite. Nightmares, vivid and relentless, haunted his slumber, each one a terrifying tableau of contorted faces and malevolent eyes. He was adrift in a sea of isolation, his grip on reality slipping with each passing moment. Driven by a sliver of hope, a desperate need to reclaim his sanity, John forced himself to leave the confines of his apartment. He ventured back to the doctor's office, his steps shaky, his body racked with tremors of fear and exhaustion. The faces he passed on the street, a nightmarish blur, seemed to mock his futile attempt to seek help. The waiting room, filled with the murmur of conversation and the rustle of magazines, felt like an assault on his senses. Each cough, each sigh, each turn of a page sent a jolt of fear through him. The faces of the other patients, distorted and menacing, seemed to watch his every move, their expressions a mixture of mockery and malice. When his name was finally called, John flinched as if struck. He stumbled to his feet, his legs feeling like lead weights. John awoke to the sterile white walls of a hospital room, the smell of antiseptic stinging his nostrils. A dull throbbing pulsed behind his eyes, each beat a hammer blow against his skull. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced him back against the thin pillow. Disoriented and afraid, his heart pounded a frantic tattoo against his ribs. He was alone, but he could feel their eyes upon him. The demonic faces, once confined to the outside world, had breached the walls of his sanctuary, seeping into the very fabric of his existence. They leered at him from the shadows in the corners, their features shifting and contorting in the dim light. A figure materialized from the shadows, her white uniform a stark contrast to the darkness that clung to her. It was the nurse, her face a grotesque mask of decay, her eyes two black pits in her skull. John shrank back against the headboard, his breath catching in his throat. "Time for your medicine, Mr. Blackwood," she rasped, her voice a chilling whisper that seemed to slither from between rotting teeth. John shook his head, his pulse quickening. The pills he knew were useless. They did nothing to quell the terror, to silence the demonic chorus that echoed in his mind. He thrashed against the restraints that bound him to the bed, his struggles fueled by a primal fear that transcended reason. Days bled into nights, each one an eternity of terror. John lost track of time, his world reduced to the confines of his padded cell. The demonic faces were his only companions, their presence a constant torment, their whispers a symphony of madness. He no longer fought against the medication, the injections that plunged him into a drugged stupor. Apathy had replaced terror, a chilling indifference settling over him like a shroud. He was a hollow shell, his mind a battleground ravaged by forces he could neither comprehend nor control. A surge of raw, primal energy, a desperate gasp for freedom jolted John from his stupor. He was no longer bound by the restraints, the medication's fog receding like a nightmare's embrace loosening its grip. He could taste it now, the metallic tang of fear, the bitter truth of his confinement. These weren't hallucinations. These demons were real, and this asylum, their twisted playground. He had to escape. The thought pulsed in his mind, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. His bare feet moved silently across the cold tile floor, avoiding the patches of moonlight that spilled through the barred window. His heart pounded against his ribs, a drumbeat urging him forward. The heavy steel door swung open with a groan, revealing a moonlit courtyard enclosed by towering brick walls topped with razor wire. Freedom, so close, yet still a world away. John took a step outside, the night air cold against his skin, the silence shattered by the distant howl of a siren. He didn't make it 2 steps before the hunt began. A guttural roar echoed through the courtyard, the sound primal, terrifying, and undeniably real. John whirled around to see the demonic nurse emerge from the shadows, her eyes burning with a malevolent light, her teeth bared in a snarl. Section 3. The Asylum. John didn't remember how long he ran, his lungs burning, legs screaming for respite. The asylum grounds stretched before him, an endless maze of manicured lawns and looming buildings. Each shadow seemed to hold a lurking terror. He could hear them now, their heavy footfalls pounding the pavement behind him. He stumbled, falling to his knees on the cold asphalt. Standing before him, framed by the asylum's imposing gates, was the doctor. "Welcome back, Mr. Blackwood," he said. "We've been expecting you." John Blackwood became a permanent resident of the asylum, his life a series of repetitive days and terror-filled nights. His room, a sanitized cage with padded walls, offered no solace from the demons that clung to his perception. The doctors, their faces a kaleidoscope of monstrous visages, spoke of medications and therapies. He was a ghost haunting the sterile corridors, his eyes vacant, his steps shuffling beneath the weight of his shattered sanity. The other patients whispered to him, their words a jumble of paranoia and delusion. He was lost in a world where reality was fluid, faces morphing into nightmarish visages. Moments of clarity were fleeting, chased away by the encroaching darkness. reminding him he was trapped in his own personal hell. The face in every mirror. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the torment within. But for John Blackwood, time stood still. He was frozen in his own private purgatory. John, once rational, was now a prisoner of his own perception. Every face, even his own reflection, was a chilling reminder of the demonic forces. And as he stared out the barred window, he knew he was beyond saving.